Very pleased that people are able to join us today, and I'm happy to be hosting, at least for a short period of time, my friend and colleague, Daisaku Higashi, who's going to be speaking about engaging with mediation and peacebuilding in the age of division, the war in Ukraine, South Sudan, and Afghanistan. So let me just briefly say Professor Higashi is a leading expert on mediation during armed conflict and post-conflict peacebuilding. He has visited Afghanistan a number of times, most recently in February 2023 as a UNDP Senior Peacebuilding Consultant. He also has been sent many times to visit South Sudan, and most recently there in March, I think, 2023, where he had meetings with senior leaders, including Riek Machar, first Vice President of South Sudan. He's also made a number of proposals, and I got to listen to a presentation that he made relatively recently, a number of proposals about the roles that Japan might play as chair of the G7 to create momentum for a peace agreement in Ukraine. Daisaku is a professor at Sophia University in Tokyo. He has a background, and I've known Daisaku for about 15 or 20 years at this point. Time marches. He was a program director at NHK, producing documentaries, including one on rebuilding Iraq, which I actually have on my shelves behind me still, and occasionally get to show to my students. He was with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan as a team leader for reconciliation and reintegration in Kabul, and also took time out to be Minister Counselor with the Permanent Mission of Japan to the UN between 2012 and 14 as part of an exchange program between MOFA, the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the University of Tokyo, where he at that time was an associate professor. You've got a lot of his information, ideas about his books or references to his books in his biographical notes. So at this point, I will be quiet and will happily hand it over to you, Daisaku. And thank you very much for taking the time to join us and speak to us today.
Thank you very much for Alistair's and your great introductions. I also really appreciate Felicia and Joanne and also another staff who kindly hosted today's talk. I'm very excited to share my research and my engagement with you today and to get a lot of feedbacks. I'm also very happy to see the name of the David Welch, who supported my PhD study a lot when he was in the University of Toronto. So I'm very happy to be here. Let me share the slide and so this is the title for today's talk, and I will talk basically 5 things: process of writing the book, how can we end the war in Ukraine, which was published this February, and my argument in this particular book, and also challenge of peace building in South Sudan, Afghanistan, and some conclusions. As Alistair kindly introduced, I started my career as a program director of NHK, Japanese public TV company, and I made a lot of documentary on the international conflict like Vietnam War, Middle East peace talk, spending 3 months in Israel, Palestine, Gaza, and also North Korea nuclear crisis, and the rebuilding Iraq challenge the nation, which I got the silver medal from American Correspondent Association in New York. But I wanted to be expert on the peace building, so I quit my job and I did my master and PhD in the political science at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And I conducted my field research at Afghanistan East Timor in 2008. So that's the reason why I was able to get the job as a team leader for reconciliation and integration in UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan in Kabul for 1 year. And then I transferred to associate professor at the University of Tokyo. I completed my PhD from UBC. And then I was appointed to the Minister Counselor in the Japanese Mission to the nation, in charge of the mediation and peacebuilding. And I returned to the university, and I was invited to the tenure position at Sophia University in 2016. And I published my first English book, Challenge of Constructing Legitimacy in Peacebuilding, from Routledge in 2015, based on my PhD dissertations. And in this particular book, I argue that in order to create some kind of legitimate government in which people have a compliance in the voluntary mode, not by coercion, in the process of peace building, assuming that creating a democratic state, we probably need to have 4 key factors. One is that we need to have some credible third parties, which can ensure the kind of impartiality to the election or constitution or the mobilizations. And of course, United Nations is not perfect, but compared with some global power, like the United States in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Nigeria in the East Timors, Sierra Leone or Australia in the East Timors, United Nations still seems to have some comparative advantage in giving a sense of the impartialities, especially to the local peoples. We also need to have some inclusive political process, which mean do not exclude some certain political or ethnic groups. We also need to improve the living condition of the people by some resource distributions. And we need to have some level of the coercion, like police and the militaries. And if we have those 4 key factors, we tend to have a compliance to the result of the election, constitution, demobilizations. And if you have repeated compliance, government can be legitimate in the long run, especially in the eye of the local peoples. But if you have a repeated non-compliance or rejections, the government will be eroded. And this is the argument I presented in the 2015, and I argue that Iraq and Afghanistan seems to go into that direction, and the East Timor and Sierra Leone seems going to that directions. And in terms of Afghanistan, as you know, 2 years ago, the previous government actually was collapsed. And then I published my 5th Japanese book, Civil War and Mediation in 2020, based on my accumulated research on South Sudan, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and East Timors. And then Corona started, so I focused on writing a next English book, and I published Inclusivity, Mediation, Peacebuildings from Edward Elgars last January 2022. And it became part of the ACUN series on system, partially supported because of the review of the Aristotles. And in this particular book, I argue that there are some kind of different natures of the inclusivity in the phase of the post-conflict peace building and in the phase of the mediation during armed conflict. In the phase of the post-conflict peace building, yes, inclusivity or avoiding political exclusion is a key to success. But in terms of the mediation during armed conflict or in the phase of the peace negotiations, inclusivity needs to have some kind of flexibilities. Because if you have too many political groups in the negotiation table, they might not be able to reach a peace agreement at first place. So in terms of the inclusivity in the phase of the mediations, we need to have actually flexible approaches. In terms of the international actors, yes, United Nations should still play a central role in the post-conflict peace building, because if one power dominates nation-building process, those countries might be perceived as like a neo-colonialism. So United Nations still has some comparative advantage, I guess. But in terms of mediation during armed conflict, it's very difficult for the United Nations to play some significant role. And in the end of the day, it was global powers and also neighboring states which have a primary responsibility to actually leverage on convincing a conflict party to make a peace agreement. So those are things that I argued in my latest book. And then Russia invaded Ukraine last February. So I spent I went to the Moldova to interview many Ukrainian refugees. I also went to Turkey to do some research about mediation, and also went to Saudi Arabia to know how Global South try to react to this crisis. And I published How Can We End the War in Ukraine on February this year. And in this particular book, I made some analysis, but as you know, now there's a fighting in the Ukraine between the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces, and it become kind of stalemate on the front line. But one thing I emphasize in my book is that after the end of the World War II, it became very difficult for global powers to create or maintain the puppet government by military interventions, because the norm of self-determination and anti-colonialism become very strong and resilient. So those type of the war actually were ended when the global power withdrew their forces. It was a case in the French War, Indonesia and Algeria. It was a case in the Vietnam War, where United States withdrew the forces from South Vietnam. The war was ended. USSR invaded Afghanistan in 1979. After 10 years quagmire, USSR decided to withdraw the forces from Afghanistan, and the war was actually ended. And then the United States made a military intervention in Afghanistan in 2001. After 20 years of quagmire, United States decided to withdraw the forces, and the war actually was ended. And as you know, US invasion to Iraq also has a huge challenges. But I think there's one important recognition that actually small state began peace negotiation with powerful state in a third country when they were still fighting. And actually they obtained the political agreement on the withdrawal of the forces from the powerful states in those negotiations. So yes, small country might need to have some military resistance, but they also have some political negotiation with a powerful state to obtain the withdrawal of the forces. It was case in the Paris Agreement in 1973 that the United States and North Vietnam had a peace agreement in Paris, and the United States decided to withdraw forces. It was same in Geneva Accord in 1988, and the USSR decided to withdraw the forces from Afghanistan, having a negotiation with Afghan stakeholder first. And then United States and Taliban had a series of the negotiations in Qatar until February 2020, and the United States decided to withdraw all forces from Afghanistan in 14 months. And actually they did it. So it's nothing wrong, for example, for Ukraine to have political negotiation with Russia in a third country, even if Russia still stay in some part of the Ukraine, because it's possible to gain the political agreement that powerful state withdraws the forces from so invaded countries. And this is one of the important propositions. And I argue that there are three challenges to end the war in the Ukraine. One is the dispute of territory. The second is the war crimes. And the third is how to create kind of post-war security frameworks, including Russia, and also as well as the issue of the war compensations. In terms of the dispute of the territories, I always have a huge attention on the negotiation between the Ukraine and the Russia in Turkey, brokered by Turkey, on March 29, 2022. And in this in-person negotiations, Ukraine delegation proposed basically four things. One is the withdrawal of the Russian forces to the line of 24 February 2020, basically before Russia invaded Ukraine. And the second, in terms of the Crimeas, the Ukraine and Russia need to have a negotiation for almost 15 years after ending the war. And also, Ukraine will not enter the NATO. This is a proposition that Ukraine suggested in March last year. And the fourth, Ukraine suggested creating a new security framework, including Russia and the P5. So looking at those proposals, Russian delegation basically agree on those offers, according to the US official, which was leaked last September. So actually, Russia decided to withdraw some forces from the northern part of the Ukraine, and the massacre or civilian deaths in the Bucha was funded. And for example, Prime Minister of UK at that time, Mr. Johnson, mentioned that this is a war crime and Putin need to be prosecuted. And Russia decided suspended entire negotiations. So, but I think after the years or months and the years attritions and the fighting, it might be the line that they might be able to agree. It might not be the exactly same thing, but it might become the basis for the negotiations. So now the position of the Ukraine and Russia are totally different, but those four items could be the kind of basis for the future negotiation. This is my idea. So in terms of the dispute of the territories, President Zelensky defined that if Russia withdraws the forces to the line of 24 February 2022, it's a huge victory for the Ukraine. now Mr. Zelensky changed the position that they want to, return or get back all the territories of the Ukraine. But I think this withdrawal of the Russian forces to the line of the 24 February 2020 could be a more realistic line. And I'm not arguing that Ukraine should give up the Crimea, but it can be negotiated after the ending of war, as Ukraine actually proposed in March 2022. In terms of the war crimes, I think we need to be a little bit flexible. In case that Mr. Putin remains the power as a president, if the prosecution of the Mr. Putin became the condition to make a peace deal, there's be no end of war as long as Mr. Putin remains the power. We need to recognize it. There's no leadership which made a decision to make a peace agreement when they know that they will be prosecuted. But if Mr. Putin is stepped down, or for example, arrested by some internal coup, it might be possible for his successor to hand over the Mr. Putin to the International Criminal Court or another court. So I think we need to be very flexible on these particular issues. But now Ukraine is insisting the prosecution of more than 100,000 Russian forces who might have committed war crimes. In theory, it's possible if Ukraine get unconditional surrender from Russia by advancing to the Moscow, like the United States, the United Nations did it against Germany or Japan in the end of World War II, and to make entire prosecutions of the war crimes. But Russia now has 6,000 nuclear weapons, and I'm not quite sure it's really plausible for Ukraine to get unconditional surrender from the Russia. And if that's the case, well, one of the way out is to create some, for example, like a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which was established in like East Timor, South Sudan, and also even the South Africa, to investigate some fact about what is going on and think about some individual compensation for the victims. But this is very controversial issues. I appreciate your comment. In terms of regarding a post-war security frameworks, a proposal by Ukraine on March 2022 had some element to create a new security framework, including Russia and the P5. But now Ukraine really insists that they need to be member of the NATO. But it still might take a lot of years or many years, even for NATO to admit Ukraine to become members. So for temporary arrangement, if Russia and Ukraine can agree on some peace deal, it may be important for UN Security Council to start considering dispatching a UN peacekeeping operation to maintain ceasefire for some time, so that Ukraine, Russia, and Europe can discuss what is a good security arrangement, including a possible entry of the Ukraine into NATO. So this is one of the things that maybe we can think about. And when I was in New York, it was not public debate, but there's some internal discussion on these possibilities. In terms of the war compensations, it may be possible to apply Japanese approach to after the World War II, because of the rest of the World War II, United Nations did not ask Germany and Japan to pay for the war compensations. But Japan provided a lot of official development assistance to like South Korea or China, so many countries in Southeast Asia after the World War II as kindly virtually part of the compensations about or for what Japan did during World War II. So it might be possible to create some kind of reconstruction trust fund for Ukraine, and actually Russia will substantially fund it. So that was one of the ways to get, real money for the reconstruction by Russia, but to keep some, face saving for them. And then I would like to discuss what could be approaches to overcome these challenges. And first question is, could be who can persuade conflicted parties? And as I argued that in the time of the phase of mediations, it's a global powers and neighboring state which have a primary responsibility over, leverage. And in terms of this particular war, I still argue that the United States has the biggest leverage on Ukraine on how to end the war, because the United States continue to support Ukraine, at least until now, for military engagement. In terms of Russia, I think it's still China which has the biggest leverage on Russia, because China continue to import oil and gas from Russia, and China has some diplomatic relationship with the Russians. So it may be possible for some countries, including Japan or even Canada, to keep some internal, not public, but internal discussion with the United States and China to create some common lines to end the war. And I think a withdrawal of the Russian forces to the line of February 22, February 24, 2022, could be the basis that global power can actually agree as a kind of vision to end the war. But this is also a very controversial issue, but I appreciate your comment. And second, who could mediate Ukraine and the Russians? And there's one good example that Turkey and the United Nations mediate Ukraine and Russia and achieved the grain export deal in July 2022. And based on this agreement, almost 30,000 tons of the feed and the grain was exported. Unfortunately, it was suspended in July this year, but this framework that Turkey and the United Nations mediate Ukraine and Russia can be a framework for the future negotiations. In terms of how can we make global, and also I argue that it's very important for us to have some kind of global momentum to end the war in Ukraine, basically pushing Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. And I keep arguing from the beginning of this war that it's crucial not to frame the war in Ukraine as a battle between the democracy versus autocracy, which some people, especially in the United States, are doing. Because there are almost 55% of the country which are still not democratic. But even those non-democratic states do not invade foreign countries and try to occupy some territories. So they basically respect this fundamental rule of the international order, respecting sovereignties. So it should be framed as a battle between the state which comply with the fundamental rule, which is respecting the sovereignty, versus state which do not comply with it. And at least 141 member states supported the UN General Assembly resolution to request Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine in both 2022 and also in spring in 2023. So this is a line that I think many countries actually can get united. I also argue that Japan, as the chair of G7 this year, can keep making this effort to create some global momentum to push Russia to withdraw its forces. Working with India, chair of G20 this year, and outreaching to the third world country like Middle East, Africa, and South America. So I made that argument when I had a chance to debate with the Foreign Minister Hayashi on February 26 this year in the Sunday debate by NHK. I don't know how it has impacted, but in the beginning of the March, Japan approached to India, and Prime Minister Kishida met Prime Minister Modi of India on March 20, and they called for international community to maintain fundamental rule of international orders and need to outreach global countries. When Japan hosted the G7 summit in May, Hiroshima, Japan chaired outreach meeting on the third day, inviting Australia, Brazil, chair of EU, chair of G20, chair of ASEAN, South Korea, Vietnam. So at least Japan tried to make some effort to create some global coalitions to push Russia to withdraw the forces. At the same time, I keep arguing that even if the Western country focus on the war in Ukraine, maybe now focus on the war in Gaza, the global challenges such as regional conflict, global warming, drought, pandemic are not finished. So I think it's very important for Japan and the West to address these global challenges, especially in the Middle East and Africa. And it's crucial even for creating this kind of global momentum to push Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. So this is a context that I keep engaging with South Sudan. As you know, South Sudan became independent in July 2011 after they had a 50 years war against the Harutsuns, regime of Harutsuns. But just 2 years later, civil war was started between the President Kiir and Vice President Machar of South Sudan. So President Kiir represents the Dinka, the biggest tribe in the South Sudan, and the Vice President Machar represents the Nuer, which is the second biggest tribe in the South Sudan, and they started fighting. In August 2015, there was some peace agreement. So next year, Riek Machar returned to Juba, and the transitional government was formed. But 3 months later, they started fighting again. So there was a kind of revitalized peace process for South Sudan, together with function of not only President Kiir and Vice President Machar, but also almost 20 political groups of South Sudan. This one was, organized by IGAD, East African Regional Bloc, and IGAD wanted to make some kind of inclusive, political negotiation. But there's a reality that there's no sight in having any peace agreement by a series of the negotiation by those 20 groups, because there are too many groups and they just keep saying their own position, but it was very difficult to make any agreement. So in the end of the day, the chair of the IGAD, which is Ethiopia, decided to invite both President Kiir and Vice President Machar to have some bilateral meeting in Ethiopia. But they could not still make any agreement. So Abiy, who is the prime minister of Ethiopia, requested Bashir, the president of Sudan, to make mediations. And Bashir, who was the president of Sudan, accepted that offer, and because he had a leverage against Vice President Machar of South Sudan, because he supported Machar for many, many years. But he did not have any leverage for the President Kiir. But he called President of Uganda, Museveni, to bring him to come to Khartoum for peace negotiations. Because it was a president of Uganda which supported President Kiir for many, many years. So in the end of the day, he brought President Kiir to the Khartoum, and they had a huge or intensive negotiation for 1 month in July 2018. And they had some basic agreement, and then they approached another 20 political groups, and they're able to make a comprehensive peace agreement in September 2018. And not so many people know it, but Japanese government actually funded all the cost of the mediation by IGAD from 2017 to 2019. So this was a context that I was assigned by Japanese foreign minister to go to South Sudan to make some contribution to peace building in 2019. And I met Taban Dengai, first president of South Sudan at that time, and also Minister in Cabinet Affairs, Minister of Higher Education, the person who steer national dialogue, head of UN mission in South Sudan, IGAD special envoy for South Sudan, and also I delivered a lecture at Chiba University. Most of them used to be the refugee, but they are very passionate about running the peace building. And also Japan International Cooperation agencies restarted construction of the Freedom Bridge in Juba, crossing the Nile rivers, and also they started, the construction of a new water system in Juba because the war was actually when it was ended. And in February 2020, the revitalized transitional government was established when Mr. Machar returned to Juba as a first vice president again. It was a basically power-sharing cabinet, so 20 cabinet appointed by President Kiir, 9 by Machar, and 6 by other groups. But it's amazing that, remarkable that at least this 2018 peace agreement has still been maintained as of today, even though there are many fragilities. So I hosted online symposium on South Sudan in April 2021, together with Vice President Taban Dengai. And Japan achieved or completed the construction of the Freedom Bridge in May 2022. So President Kiir, Vice President Machar joined the ceremony, and they really said that they appreciate Japanese contributions. And then I was able to go back to South Sudan after the Corona pandemic this March, as a foreign minister assigned me to go there again. So I met the Taban Dengai and have a one-hour discussion. I also had a discussion with Nicholas Hayson, who is the #1 in the South Sudan mission. And JICA completed the water system. So they put water from Nile rivers, and they created very drinking waters by these water systems. They put the drinking water to the top of the mountain, and they push to the 8 water stations, so they can start getting a clean working waters. They used to have only water coming from Nile River and put the medicine to sell. So many people got sick, but now they can get the drinking water. Many people also can bring the bucket to the 120 water kiosk, and if they pay a little bit money, they can get drinking water. So due to these systems, 400,000 people in Juba start having access to the clean water. Why there is only 100,000 people who had access to the clean water before this water system was established? So I was also asked to deliver a lecture at Juba University, and also deliver the lecture at South Sudan Public Corporations. And also I met Dr. Riek Machar for 1 hour to discuss what could be the challenge of the peace building in the South Sudan. And based on those field research, I found that there's of course, there are many, many challenges of South Sudan peace building, but one of the biggest challenges, South Sudan leadership decided to have a presidential elections in the end of 2024, next year. But the UN argued, or leadership of the United Nations argued publicly that they need to establish followings before the election. One is the electoral law, which was just passed 1 month ago, but they also need to create electoral commissions in 10 different states, and there's no electoral commission yet. Also, they need to create a constitution which becomes basis for the electoral law, but does not exist. They need to create a constitutional committee which adapt the constitution, but there is no constitutional committee yet. And also, security in the local area very fragile, actually very bad. So because there are many communal fightings in the local areas. Now, where you don't have securities, it's very difficult to conduct an election which can be perceived as fair and free. And if one side lose the powers, political power, they also lose the entire power to economic access of the oil revenue or economic revenue. So it's very dangerous to rush elections when you don't have enough preparation. So I continue to argue that it's very crucial not to rush having an election. It should make government institutional first. This is what Canadian famous professor Laurent Parry argued, I think, 20 years ago. Right? We need to have an institution first before you rush to the election. And I think it's still very applicable. And there are many challenges of African UN peacekeeping or peacebuilding effort, as you know, in terms of Mali dictatorship, which was established last year, continue to request United Nations to withdraw the forces together with Russia, because Mali dictatorship working with the Wagners. And UN Security Council decided to withdraw all the forces by the end of this year. DRC also, there is a rumor that DRC start having a lot of cooperation with Wagners. The United Nations might withdraw all the forces by the end of next year. Central African Republic started having a huge collaboration with Wagner to fight against the rebels. So I think South Sudan might be only the places that the United Nations can have some commitment to create a peace. So international community needs to become a little bit modest for its scope of peace building, self-reliance, and which could be like a self-reliance in the stabilities. So this is one of the conclusions about my research on the South Sudan. So this is my last case, Afghanistan, which I made a lot of the commitment, including my research in 2008 and also my working as a UNAMA political affairs officer from the 2009 to the end of 2010. And as you know, Taliban controlled the entire country in August 2021 when United States withdrew the forces. And then on that day, United States froze the financial asset of Afghan Central Bank for $7 billion. United States also stopped the transfer of the money to Afghanistan except for humanitarian aid. And there's a severe drought caused by global warming. So UN warned that 70% of the population is extremely poverty. And 6 million people, many of women and children, actually might die due to the starvation. And I think the situation is still the same. And I keep arguing in many media and meetings that there are two contradictions of these financial sanctions United States frozen the asset of Central African Central Bank and froze the banking system to protect human rights of Afghan people. But if this blanket financial sanction can result in the death of the millions vulnerable, innocent Afghan people, overwhelming women and children, exact people that the sanction is aimed to protect, I think it's totally contradictory. And there are many actual US media which mention that these contradictions. I also found that if the Taliban is collapsed by the sanction, actually Afghanistan will enter another civil war, and it's ISISK which will gain more territory and the power, maybe 1/3 or 2/3 of the territory, because this is the biggest, second biggest military wing right now in Afghanistan. So this is the worst case scenario for Afghan people living inside the United States and the bar for even counterterrorism. So I keep assisting the need to save the life of Afghan people in the many media exposures. And this is a context of Ms. Yoko Kamikawa, who is the president of Japan Parliamentarians Federation on Population, which is like a non-partisan working group on discussing global issues, requested me to deliver the lecture on Afghan humanitarian crisis and role of Japan on December 8, 2021. So I made 5 proposals to Japanese government, including provide humanitarian assistance as much as possible, support Japanese NGO as well, and define humanitarian assistance broadly so that it can start supporting education and agriculture as well. And also it might be good to make some internal advice to the United States to remove the financial sanctions. So they proposed this Japan Parliamentarians Federation population led by Mr. Kamikawa submitted my 5 proposals to Mr. Hayashi, Foreign Minister of Japan, in the end of December 2021. And one of the reasons why I'm confident about Japanese engagement is that there's one Japanese NGO which made a very miracle irrigation systems. So this Dr. Tetsu Nakamura, who worked for Afghanistan for 35 years, found it that drought caused by climate change is the biggest threat for Afghanistan 20 years ago. So he started working with 100 Afghan farmers to create a kind of man-made canal for the irrigation by using Japanese traditional approach, which was established 250 years ago. So they put the water from big river, like a Kunal River, to those kind of man-made irrigations. And because it's a very traditional method, Afghan farmer can make it. So when there's a problem or destroyed, Afghan farmer can fix it. So it's become very sustainable. So this is a place which used to be agricultural field, but which become desert because of the drought. But 10 years later, because of the irrigations, it became a totally agricultural field. This is another place which became desert after the drought, but entire field became agricultural field. So now about 24,000 hectares become, or restored to be agricultural field, and 1 million farmers are living in those areas. And Afghanistan has only 40 million people, so 1 out of 40 people actually start enjoying this project. So they can have a lot of lemon, they can have a lot of cows, they can have a lot of rice, they can have a lot of honey, they can have a lot of green peas, they can have a lot of feed, they can have a lot of rice again. So I keep arguing that it's crucial to expand this Japanese NGO, PMS, Japan Medical Service, irrigation system to our entire country. And Japan Parliamentarians Federation for Population actually established Afghan project team to maintain this kind of support for Afghanistan. I also had a chance to go to Saudi Arabia, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which has about 57 member states, kindly hosted my talk. And Mr. Tariq, OIC Special Envoy for Afghanistan, kindly moderated my talk, and we confirmed kind of future cooperations. And then I had a chance to go to Afghanistan as a UNDP Senior Peacebuilding Consultant in this February. And so I continue to share this kind of argument, and also this irrigation system, which was established in Nangarhar province. So all leadership and also UN agency unanimously support the idea of expanding this PMS irrigation project to the entire country, because this is a way that the people can start having a kind of self-reliance. So I returned to Saudi Arabia again in this March, and the Islamic Development Bank hosted my talk on Japanese aid in Afghanistan. And then using fund of the Sophia University, which I belonged, I was able to invite Ambassador Tariq of special OIC and also Islamic Development Bank head of Afghan Trust Fund to Tokyo to have a 3-day workshops. So we continue to have a discussion about how OIC, Islamic Development Bank, JICA, and the Japanese NGO can cooperate to expand this irrigation system, not only to Afghanistan, but also entire like Middle East and also Africa, which suffer from the drought caused by global warming. And Ms. Yoko Kamikawa, president of JPFP, and Mr. Hitoshi Kawakawa, chair of Foreign Affairs Committee, also hosted the talk or a conversation with Ambassador Tariq and the ISTP representatives. And the Japanese Director General in charge of Middle East also hosted the dinner and also hosted the big symposium to have a public discussion as well. So when Prime Minister Kishida went to Saudi Arabia in July this year and to meet Secretary General of OIC, Prime Minister Kishida suggested that he wants to expand the collaboration with OIC in supporting Afghanistan. So it became a little bit institutionalized that the Japan and OIC will continue to work together. And the government of Japan then officially approved the Triangle Project by PMS, this Japanese NGO, JICA, and FAO is expanding PMS irrigation system to the entire country of Afghanistan in the end of July. And then in September, Ms. Yoko Kamikawa became new foreign minister of Japan. So I hope she continued to make some engagement or effort to support those kind of things. So in terms of conclusion of supporting Afghanistan, if the purpose of some donor is to support expansion of democracy or expansion of democratic countries, they might have no interest in supporting Afghanistan. I understand, Taliban is not seeking for the democratic state, at least right now. But I argue that Japan has a kind of long tradition of supporting self-reliance and stability in suffering state, even if those countries still do not have enough condition to become a democratic state. And if we define the purpose of engaging with Afghanistan as supporting like a self-reliance, so that people can live by themselves, and the stability, so that it will not become safe haven for the international terrorist groups, there are several positive aspects by the Taliban de facto government governance. For example, security has drastically improved. When I got the security briefing from UN people in this February, they say United Nations now can go every district in every provinces without any guard, because Taliban is very strict for the normal crimes. It's very astonishing improvement. Corruption has also dramatically reduced, according to the head of the many UN agencies, and also Japanese NGO has the same argument. Poppy production in the southern part of Afghanistan also reduced 95%, according to the UN reports. So there's some positive aspect as well, and I think it's important to recognize it. So when I went to the New York in this October to share my idea with the UN Assistant Secretary General in charge of Afghanistan, I argue that it's crucial to remove the financial sanction against Afghanistan so that it can normalize economy and the people. So people start living without threat of the starvations. And also Japan, some donors which can share those kind of value can enhance support for self-reliance and the stability of Afghanistan and empowering people on the ground, including expansion of this kind of irrigation system. And simultaneously, donors can keep or should keep engaging with the Taliban de facto government to reopen access of the women to education and the workforce. Because this is something that Taliban promised to the international community or entire world that they will do it even after they return the powers. So those are kind of my proposition or proposals. In terms of the concluding this entire lectures, we are facing so many wars simultaneously right now. And I think it's time to start discussing how to end the wars one by one with some realistic approaches and understanding dynamics on the ground. Not only how to support some position of the world. So thank you very much for listening to my lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your lecture. That was a lot of really important information, especially in this day and age. A lot of questions surrounding peace building and different strategies that could potentially, show positive results, which you've indicated in some cases there has been some success.